This is Stand Up for the Truth, addressing important issues and topics affecting Christians across the nation.
Good morning, it's Crash Connell along with Mary Danielsen, and we got a brand new, fresh new podcast for you. Last Friday in June 28, 2024. Good morning.
Good morning. It is the last Friday in June. And it's headline day, actually more like rabbit trail day, an opportunity to look behind the headlines in such a way to help us understand the significance of certain events, help us to hear them maybe a little more clearly, and deepen our understanding of how the Lord works in the world, particularly in the last days. I'm also calling it Fact Check Friday because, after that debate, after everybody gets over how it went, depending on who you talk to, but even if you talk to CNN, they'll say Trump won by 67% to 33%. That was the poll, the exit poll. And now what they're going to do is they're going to rummage through their files and computers and look to fact check. So that's going to be the next big thing on the list. It was a very interesting day. I don't normally watch those, but I felt that I needed to. I wanted to see just how bad things were. Anyway, it was very, very interesting, and I'm sure a lot of you have thoughts on that as well. So I'm going to jump in today with Psalm 104, 1-5. O Lord, my God, you are very great. You are clothed with honor and majesty, who cover yourself with light as with a garment, who stretch out the heavens like a curtain. He lays the beams of his upper chambers in the waters, who makes the clouds his chariot, who walks on the wings of the wind, who makes his angels spirits, his ministers a flame of fire. You who laid the foundations of the earth so that it should not be moved forever. Lord, we are grateful for another day to serve you. Lord, we thank you that you order our steps and give our lives meaning. We lift up those in our lives who have not yet surrendered to you, that they would not rest in the futility of their lives, but that rather they would begin to seek you with all their hearts, knowing that there's just nothing in this world that lasts, and that they would understand the brevity of their lives. Lord, give us open doors to share our hope with neighbors and colleagues. Help us keep our eyes on you at all times, in all circumstances. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, rabbits. Speaking of rabbits, for some reason we have more rabbits in our yard this year than I can ever remember. In fact, they've pretty much overrun our neighborhood. They just sort of lay in the grass. They graze around the clock. Anytime I go outside, there's 5 or 6 of them running around. And they aren't really even afraid of us humans anymore. Some of them are the size of cats. It really is out of control. Well, trying to keep up with the headlines is a little bit like trying to keep up with the rabbits in my backyard. It's appropriate to these times. Now, I tend to think that the last days began in earnest about 150 years ago, and I'm going to tell you why I think that. When the world went from little communication and information to a global society where the explosion of humanistic and aberrant philosophies and ideologies began to flourish and find willing human hearts and minds in which to grow. Several religious cults got their start at the same time, and thanks to social media, really, any teaching can go around the world in 60 seconds and gain vast networks of followers. Now, when we exclaim that the world has changed radically lately, because every generation feels that they can rightly say that, and they can, but we mean something far more pervasive than our grandparents did. There's a mood, there's a climate, a prevailing social state of mind and heart that is unmistakable today. There have been momentous changes in the last century that have brought us to a point of no return in the culture, and I believe it can only be rectified by heavenly intervention. There is no one leader who will change anything in 4 years, 10 years. Now, I call this prevailing mood the spirit of the age, but the German word for it is Zeitgeist. As believers, we should be the most sensitive and restless about the spiritual climate. Unbelievers may not know why they feel a sense of fear or apprehension, and often desperation, but many are perceptive enough to know that life has become increasingly difficult on so many fronts, and many vocalize fears more than ever that the very survival of the human race is at risk. And they could frame that as climate change, which I would not, but they still feel that way. But if you were a citizen of my upper Midwest town somewhere around 1850 when it was new, you'd have lived a pretty simple life. I think we all know that. But you wouldn't have had a phone, a bathroom, a radio, a television, largely due to the fact that you had no electricity or running water. Your contact with the outside world would have been very limited. Even the weekly paper would have had only local news. You wouldn't have seen a McDonald's, a Walgreens, a Walmart, or a gas station for many decades to come. It's possible you wouldn't even have had a local doctor, and a hospital was even rarer. So your life expectancy was sketchy. But did you also know that in our humble town in 1850, you would never have had a Jehovah's Witness knock at your door or seen a pair of Mormons ride down Main Street, USA on a bicycle? Your children would not have been seduced by the lies of Darwinism in the school system, as there was no publicly funded school system as of yet. Your sons would not have been diagnosed with ADD since it did not exist. Your daughters would not have been deceived by the agenda of Planned Parenthood. There was no pornography industry, no R-rated music or movies, or any movies for that matter. No alternative lifestyles or transgenderism. Sin was sin and shame was shame, and public professions of faith were not discouraged. Churches were revered centers of weekly life, but things were changing in the church as well. Pastor of the late 19th century, we have excellent documentation of the beginnings of the departure from the faith that has sadly grown to maturity today, right alongside the most blatant false teachings. That pastor was Charles Spurgeon, known on both sides of the Atlantic as a forthright and faithful minister of the gospel. Now, he had a monthly magazine called The Sword and the Trowel. In March of 1887, he published, with another pastor, a series of articles entitled The Downgrade, and he did not know this at the start. But these articles would start a firestorm of controversy that would consume the final years of his life as he contended for the faith and met with much resistance in the churches. But through his series of articles, Spurgeon sounded the alarm against the invasion of liberalism, intellectualism, and postmodernism into the church. Churches of his day already were abandoning such central doctrines as the deity of Christ, the authority and sufficiency of the Word, redemption by the blood of Christ, the new birth, in favor of man's wisdom and vain philosophies. Well, who and what was he talking about, referring to, and seeing? Now, if you caught Tuesday's program with J.B. Hickson, you heard about 7 men who rule the world from the grave. And that's from a fantastic older book by a pastor named David Breeze, who's gone on to his reward. And during that podcast, we talked about the incredible influence of men like Charles Darwin, Karl Marx, John Dewey, Freud, Julius Wellhausen, Soren Kierkegaard. And really, for the most part, they all lived very close to one another on the timeline, and each one connects to or builds on the previous one. Once Darwin had opened the door to redefining life itself as previous generations had understood it, these subsequent philosophers decided that everything needed to evolve. So now we're talking economics, the psyche with Freud, education, Dewey, right down to the existential fatalism that has gripped America since the 60s and flourishes openly on our college campuses. Basically says, do your own thing. You know, as long as it doesn't hurt you, anyone else, as long as it doesn't hurt anyone else, it's okay. And all the ads we see, you know, do your own thing, all the music, that is existentialism, thanks to Soren Kierkegaard, who he was, it took 100 years after he had passed away for anything of his teachings to catch on, but they fit in with the zeitgeist or the spirit of the age. Well, it was the likes of these men that Spurgeon was talking about, and we're still talking about them because they do rule the world from the grave. They were without any true hope that is, of course, reflected in this old world. Now let's piggyback onto this philosophical humanistic downgrade and add the breakup of the European monarchies, the Ottoman Empire, which took place in the latter part of that stretch, leading to the establishment of the nation-state in Europe, out of which will come the Antichrist in God's timing. Following 2 world wars, the redeeming moment and signal of the last days, I believe, was when the modern state of Israel was established after the Jews had been dispersed or living among the nations since 70 A.D. But this morning I want to extend this discussion historically. I want to add 2 more men who I think rule the world from the grave, and I'm going to tell you why. John Foster Dulles and his younger brother, Allen Dulles. Now, why do I add them? Well, there's so much more to say about the era following the end of World War II, when the Cold War began, smack in the middle of a century of American exceptionalism, that was actually powered by fears and suspicions and a burning desire to build and maintain a certain quote-unquote American lifestyle of prosperity, combined with a certain global moral authority over other nations that dared to exist outside of the American orbit. So here's my question. Why does the United States behave the way it does in the world? Have you ever wondered that? I think a lot of people have. Well, you may recall the headlines from last week when Putin paid a visit to North Korea and then to North Vietnam. Jeff Childers of the Coffee and COVID blog said at the time that it looks like Putin is on a mission to put the old Soviet-era band back together. And part of the driving force of his actions last week is obviously the Ukraine situation. And the worst idea yet, from the worst U.S. president yet, is to allow the Ukraine to attack Russian territory using U.S.-supplied weapons. Now, how can that not elicit warnings of World War III from independent media who are seeing the handwriting on the wall? Well, Putin, speaking in Vietnam right after he signed a mutual defense treaty with North Korea, and it was just an updated one from 1961 at the height of the Cold War. They just re-signed. He warned that Moscow is willing to arm Pyongyang, which is the capital of North Korea, if the U.S. and its allies continue to supply Ukraine with weapons. He said those who supply these weapons believe that they are not at war with us. Well, I say then that we reserve the right to supply weapons to other regions of the world. Well, naturally. He also signed a deal with North Vietnam that includes, among other things, cooperation in the areas of defense and security. What other regions? Well, the Soviet ones, of course, Cold War regions. And Mark Hitchcock says this, speaking of Russia and North Korea, the Kremlin is running low on different munitions, with many reporting that Russia could potentially run out of tanks. It seems they're appealing to outliers, rogue nations like North Korea, to help them. Many are startled by the idea of an alliance between Russia and North Korea, with the Center for Strategic and International Studies calling the summit between the two the greatest security threat to the U.S. since the end of the Korean War. And he talks about the leader of Korea is a rogue leader. He's unpredictable. They have nukes that have the ability to reach the U.S., and so this meeting between Russia and North Korea is a major development, and it's adding to the powder keg that's ready to explode in our world. And I say, yes, Russia, by all means, do escalate. And the what I call soft and uneducated media, seemingly is unable to connect any dots. And I say this with tongue-in-cheek, those Pulitzer Prize-winning types who could be educating us on wars and rumors and how this all got started, but another opportunity to inform us and give us any context has slipped through their fingers. Well, we don't need them. We can do that ourselves here on Stand Up, and that's what I'm going to do. There's no end of players and playmakers and earthly kings and kingmakers who have their 15 minutes of fame, and people who live to guide the world forward to some great frontier where none have gone before. Well, this is what they think anyway. And isn't that what shaped America in the first place? Maybe. But who, if anyone, has or had the legal or moral authority to draw lines or boundaries and hedge in those who want to influence and sway over the masses? If the story of the Dulles brothers tells us anything, it's that there is no one to stop the geopolitical workings where money, power, spiritual influence, and opportunity intersect. And all that is contained and uncontained in these men. Now, these two men were seemingly born of that bent, to project power, to be influential in a big way, and that was certainly the era that birthed them. But there was a lot more going on, as we're going to see. Let's think of the word influencers. I mean, this is a cultural buzzword most everyone knows today. But there were also influencers in the age preceding social media, the low-tech era, very powerful men, far beyond anything that our cat-loving, photo-obsessed, and phone-obsessed influencers might understand today. And we're going to look at these two men that a lot of folks may have never heard of, the Dulles brothers, to really begin to understand that term at all. They were enormously influential in shaping the world of the 20th century. And if you've heard of Dulles International Airport, you at least know the name. For John and his younger brother Alan, thanks to a certain family lineage, the world was their oyster from very early on in their lives. Their stories are somewhat hard to believe, even for those who've been amused by the James Bond and Indiana Jones type characters. But it's true. Decades after their passing, we are the ones who have to decide if the one after whom that airport is named is a hero, a defender of his country who simply didn't think long-term about his actions, or was he a malevolent man who craved power and didn't care about long-term consequences? Either way, it's not good. Now, we tend to take for granted an America that is relatively quick to intervene overseas, police the world, send troops across the pond. The concept or doctrine, if you will, of American exceptionalism is only 100 years old, but do we ever wonder why we do the things we do internationally and the things that we take for granted when it comes to foreign policy? Now, John and Alan were very different personality-wise, but they had the same worldview. So when they rose to power in the government, they wielded double influence in world politics beginning about a century ago. The long-term effects of their era and their service is still being felt. John Foster Dulles was born in 1888. His brother Alan Welsh Dulles, 1893. They came from a long line of public servants. Their maternal grandfather was the 32nd Secretary of State, John Watson Foster. Uncle Bert, as they called him, Robert Lansing, was the 42nd Secretary of State, and John himself was the 52nd. Their father was aloof. He was a stoic kind of man. He was a strong Presbyterian Calvinist preacher and a missionary who expected and wanted his sons to follow in his footsteps, and yet one became Secretary of State, the other a grade-A government-inspected spy, and the first director of the modern CIA in the 50s under Eisenhower. Now, these two youngsters spent considerable time in their youth in the presence of the other two older gentlemen. Grandpa was a pioneer of sorts in the westward expansion of the U.S., believing in the manifest destiny of our relatively young nation, taming those wide open spaces. And he helped elect Republicans like Ulysses S. Grant, Rutherford B. Hayes, James Garfield. He served as the Secretary of State under Benjamin Harrison himself. He was Republican to the core and passionate about it. Now, Grandpa Foster was also minister to the court of Tsar Alexander II. So their mother, the boy's mother, grew up in diplomatic circles, dancing at Russian soirees, touring European capitals. She had a very privileged life. So the Kodak moment is this. They grew up with larger-than-life relatives who had a larger-than-life view of American politics, drawn to larger-than-life public servants. John Watson Foster, Grandpa, was a remarkable paragon of the American experience during the industrial age and the formative years of modern America, for sure. So what would it be? Life of a preacher and a missionary, or perhaps a diplomatic destiny? Well, having been exposed very early on to presidents, ambassadors, senators, cabinet members, justices, and others of the early 20th century American ruling class, they not only absorbed it all, they ultimately craved the life they'd been exposed to. I mean, they were listening in on these dinners at 7 and 8 years old, and there's only so much they understood. But if they had questions, there was always someone there to translate. Another thing about Grandpa that is important, he was the Secretary of State who presided over the very first American overthrow of a foreign government, Hawaii, in 1893, under Grover Cleveland, encouraging the white settlers in Hawaii to rebel against the Queen. And Grandpa Foster sent American troops to support them. That was the end of the monarchy in Hawaii. And that made John Foster the first American Secretary of State to bring about the overthrow of a foreign government. And so we shouldn't marvel at the role that John Foster Dulles played almost half a century later in overthrowing governments in Iran, Guatemala, and other places. The author of a very thorough work on the Dulleses, and there are several out there, they're very thick. They each take a different tack. But this book is called The Brothers by Stephen Kinzer, and he said, as he wrote about these two, that he began to wonder if there wasn't some genetic predisposition to regime change in the family. But that's not the power I'm thinking of, rather a much darker power indeed, and we're going to see that. I'm going to take it one more step in a more serious direction, that these men were groomed by men and devils to do the things that they did to achieve a certain end. And if there wasn't a clear spiritual hand behind the scenes in the life of these two, I would be shocked. And this possibility struck me as soon as I began to study them, handpicked. A significant turning point for our nation came about as the result of Grandpa Foster's search for a new way to do business. He came up with a new profession, a broker for corporations, looking for lobbying favors in Washington with the goal of becoming international/multinational. America was still a producing nation at this time and was manufacturing more goods than we knew what to do with. We needed foreign markets to buy the surplus, and then we could turn around and import their products from overseas, the ones that we needed, including natural resources. So Grandpa Foster went overseas to negotiate the first trade agreements and actually set himself up as a foreign policy expert. He was an opportunist, to say the very least, but this contributed to that global consumer society that we have now in a big way. And so it begins. At 19, his grandson, John Foster Dulles, was taken as a guest of Grandpa to a peace conference where he was thrown into the world of high-stakes diplomacy and international law, hobnobbing with presidents and czars himself, with Grandpa on hand to translate the inner workings of geopolitics for this teen. This was the second Hague Peace Conference in the Netherlands, which was attended by Teddy Roosevelt and Tsar Nicholas II to discuss ways to avoid an international war. With that exposure, this event flung open doors of opportunity and influence for this young man. Now, after attending law school, John Foster Dulles, his grandpa got him a job at the #1 corporate law firm in the U.S. called Sullivan and Cromwell, located on Wall Street. Well-connected is how he got that job, and well-connected is a bit of an understatement. Rather, tremendously influential is one way to describe this firm at the end of the 19th century. Every large corporation of the day retained them. Those who were very wealthy, the Carnegies, the Rockefellers, the Morgans, they all used Sullivan and Cromwell, whose sole mission was to bring investors and enterprises together to create these giant corporations. Now we're talking U.S. Steel, the first billion-dollar American company, Edison Electric, Amoco, Merck, railroads, and et cetera, et cetera. I can't overstate how elite and influential this law firm has been for over 150 years, particularly their role as counsel to these early American robber barons. And that law firm is still one of the wealthiest and most influential firms here in 2024. They're authors of creative destruction is how I like to see it, and I tend to see it. John Foster Dulles was the highest paid lawyer in America during the peak of his career, and so he himself was at the center of, #1, a national network of banks, investment firms, and industrial conglomerates that rebuilt Germany after World War I. Also, the massive investments the U.S. poured into the chemical cartel IG Farben, that we've talked about in the past on the podcast called To Die For. The profits generated by these connections flowed back to the U.S. to repay our war loans. He was unwilling at one point to cut off this flow of what I call filthy lucre to Germany, even after it was clear that Hitler was the architect of something much worse, much more than a rebuilt Germany, something far more sinister. It's as though, with all the dollar signs in his eyes, he had no moral compass whatsoever, even though the firm, which had a branch in Berlin, was headed towards a public relations disaster if they continued to operate there. And those he worked with, and even his brother Alan, said, "What are you doing? You really need to think hard about this." They wanted to pull out of Berlin. He did not want to do it. And John and his wife continued to visit Germany right up until 1938 and continued to defend them even after the Nazis invaded Poland, which doesn't say anything good about them, unless extreme naivete is at work here. But as I said, his co-workers understood it, and I think his lucrative job and his income was at war with his conscience. Well, this is important because the world was at a crossroads, and these two men were right standing in the middle of the intersection. Now, both brothers saw the world as careening towards an ultimate confrontation, not between capitalism and Nazism, but between capitalism and communism. For John, in particular, everything that happened in the world, as he saw it, was related to this conflict. And this became John's complete worldview and the pivot point of all he did and believed his entire adult life. and what would skew an entire nation from there on out. This is probably the most fascinating part of their story. Not to say that Bolshevism and communism weren't tremendous threats. They still are. And my headline that I read proves that, and in even more sinister ways than it used to be. But these two were probably the first true internationalists, the first U.S. global economists, at least in terms of putting policy into place and not just pondering some ideology in which capitalism and communism are butting heads on a global stage forever and a day. But their belief that they alone were the guardians of American expansion and that bankers and businessmen and international lawyers were going to lead the way in shaping political policy. Well, do you see where this is going? It opens the door wide to a shadow government. The fact that they didn't see any conflict with working for private clients and shaping governmental policy at the same time wasn't a conflict of interest and highly illegal? Well, that didn't stop anyone. I mean, I don't think they'd get away with that kind of conflict of interest today, although people certainly get away with a lot in politics. But they were working for bankers and private clients, and then they were turning around and shaping governmental policy. That's a phenomenal conflict of interest. But once John became the managing partner, because he rose up in the ranks rather quickly, of Sullivan and Cromwell, the banks he was working for, like Goldman Sachs, the First International Bank of Boston, and others, the firm lent more than $1 billion to Germany to aid them in paying their reparations from World War I. And the person who designed the reparations system was John Dulles himself. And making a fortune on those loans? Well, priceless, as MasterCard is fond of saying. And he continued to take U.S. matters into his own hands repeatedly. Once Congress denied the U.S. entry into the League of Nations, the first organization designed to solve international disputes after World War I, that our Congress saw would surely erode U.S. sovereignty back in those days. Well, they didn't like that Congress voted down the League of Nations, and so the brothers expressed themselves by designing a secret club with a few of their closest friends called the Council on Foreign Relations in 1921. No one said no to these two. And again, now we have the beginnings of a shadow government in the U.S., one in which foreign policy is in the hands of a few elite, and which has become far more powerful and dangerous than even these morally bankrupt types could have dreamed of. Some would easily say it is now our permanent government. They were dictating policy to the State Department. Well, I'm going to talk about Allen Dulles and intelligence. By the time Allen became a super spy, he had been with the State Department since 1916. Now, this is the younger brother, thanks to family connections, no doubt, and the beginnings of the world of military intelligence. Now, he slid right into the life of a spy. He was posted at Bern, Switzerland, right out of the gate, Neutrality Central, living a life of some work and a lot of play. Now, before World War I, Washington politicians didn't feel the need to gather intelligence on the military developments or capabilities of other nations. They thought it was, eavesdropping. But Grandpa Foster, who had already dabbled in it, establishing a military intelligence division in the last decade of the 19th century with 2 employees. That's how it started. But the boy's Uncle Bert, Robert Lansing, expanded it by 1918 in the midst of the war with over 1,200 employees who analyzed intel from the military, diplomats, the Secret Service, and other organizations. And so we're gonna continue. I don't want to continue here until after the break, because this is a good spot. We're going to talk more about intelligence and where we got the intelligence organizations that we have today and what it means for us. This is Mary Danielsen. This is Stand Up for the Truth, and we will be right back with more on this Friday. Stay tuned.
Saturday, June 20th, is time for some high-kicking comedy at the Cup of Joy with Carrie Pomerali.
I do think turning 40 has its values. Like, you get superpowers you didn't have before. Like, I can hurt myself sleeping.
Come see Carrie Pomerali as she debuts her womanly witticisms at 6:15 and 8:15 at the Cup of Joy.
You go to physical therapy, they're like, what'd you do, ma'am? I was like, I woke up, Skippy, okay? I woke up.
It's a 2-show night, 6:15 and 8:15 with Carrie Pomerali, Saturday, June 20th, the Cup of Joy.
Like, I rode a horse, and I bought the horse on Groupon. It was $5. And I get on the horse, and immediately my body's like, no, you didn't. And then the horse was like, get off, lady, you're so fat. Get off.
Cup of Joy supporting Q90 FM.
Q90 FM presents the Police Lights of Christmas, helping over 70 police departments across Wisconsin.
Each department is going to leave this night with a box full of thousands of dollars worth of gift cards.
Visit lightsofchristmas.us. Police Lights of Christmas, a ministry of Q90 FM.
Feedback, questions, and topic suggestions are always appreciated. Email us at comments@standupforthetruth.com.
Welcome back to Stand Up for the Truth for this last Friday in June 2024. And I'm talking this morning about two gentlemen who had a tremendous influence in the last century in this country, more than you can possibly imagine. And it sort of piggybacks on what I talked to J.B. Hickson about on Tuesday, 7 Men Who Rule the World from the Grave. And I'm adding my own two that I think have been tremendously influential and a lot of people have never heard of, but their story is just woven through so many other stories. And it's sort of stunning on a spiritual level. And I left off talking about Alan Dulles, the younger brother, who became a spy. Both of them were influenced by family ties, family connections. They were born into this sort of public life, to be sure. And how the intelligence agencies that we take for granted, and some of the agencies that seem to have been weaponized against us Americans, which is absolutely dreadful. But the CIA is the one that's in view here. And Alan Dulles was the first head of the CIA in the modern age. And I end talking about how there really was no intelligence because the presidents didn't really feel the need for that. They thought of it as eavesdropping. But they were convinced over the years by various players that you have to have a very involved intelligence group so that you know what's going on in the rest of the world, especially with a world war looming. Okay, so here's our crazy story number one. Alan Dulles is a super spy. He's in Switzerland, and he's partying as much as he is doing anything else. One Friday in Switzerland, Alan Dulles was preparing for a date with a couple of lovely Swiss twins, and he received a call from a Russian exile who had said he had an urgent message that he wanted delivered to the U.S. and wanted to meet with Alan that night. But Alan had party plans. He had a hot date, and he blew him off. Years later, he learned that the caller was Vladimir Lenin, and the reason Lenin did not call back was that the next day he boarded a train to St. Petersburg to set off to change the course of history. Alan Dulles later admitted, here was the first chance to start talking to a communist leader, and we lost him. No kidding. Meanwhile, in 1918, following World War I, Woodrow Wilson was personally heading up the American delegation to the peace conference convening in Paris. Now, presidents didn't do that in those days. They sent representatives. They sent secretaries of state. And all the delegates were charged with designing what the post-war world was going to look like. And guess who was in the middle of that? Now, John thought that his Uncle Bert, as Secretary of State, would represent the U.S. in Paris, and he, of course, would be able to go as part of the delegation there. Now, he was disappointed when Wilson decided to attend instead. But undaunted, John Foster Dulles found another way there as an assistant to one of Wilson's appointees, and he found himself on a committee to decide what Germany's reparations would be. He also found himself working with economist John Maynard Keynes, one of the 7 men who really do rule the world from the grave, and Jean Monnet, the father of the euro. There seems to be no connection that is not plausible with these two. Now, Alan, of course, showed up in Paris as well and ended up on a committee asked to draw the boundaries for many emerging nations after World War I. Well, I guess someone has to do it, right? These connections are absolutely mind-boggling. The overwhelming sentiment that drove the Paris Conference was that Bolshevism, according to Uncle Bert and seconded by President Wilson, is, quote, the most monstrous thing that the human mind has ever conceived. Bolshevism is just communism. It was Russia was renamed. The party was renamed as communism back in 1918 already, March of 1918. And Bolshevik or Bolshevism just means the greater or the majority. The majority-ism. So who else was in Paris? Well, a 28-year-old Vietnamese nationalist named Ho Chi Minh. At the time, France ruled Vietnam, and this was the area of colonialism. Now, having seen the world from many different angles already, Ho Chi Minh traveled the world, and then he went to this Paris conference to demand the right of self-determination for Vietnam. He wrote a paper on it, which was distributed widely, and he took a copy to Paris in 1919, hoping to give it to Woodrow Wilson. Instead, he gave it to Colonel House, a diplomat and Wilson's closest friend, chief advisor on European policy, and he had everything to do with Wilson becoming president in the first place. And if you'll remember, if you know your Federal Reserve story, Colonel House and Woodrow Wilson were the ones that drafted and passed that in his administration. So here we have one of the most influential communist leaders of the 20th century, and Colonel House being one of the most influential men of the 20th century that I think no one has ever heard of, basically. You gotta go down those rabbit trails to find out who these guys were. Yet another connection was that Woodrow Wilson was the Dulles brothers' favorite professor at Princeton, and they were very close friends already at a young age. Anyway, Woodrow Wilson believed strongly in the principle of self-determination as long as a nation was part of, the Ottoman Empire or the Hungarian-Austrian empires. But in the case of these Far East nations who were under colonial rule by Britain or France or Japan, for instance, such as Vietnam, the answer to them was, sorry, you are incapable of governing yourself. And this was greatly resented by the nations of what was called the Indochina region at the time. Now, Ho Chi Minh left Paris empty-handed. Lenin left empty-handed. But a year later, Ho Chi Minh joined the Communist Party and set out to wage war against the Western powers that be, and 30 years later would run into that manifest destiny doctrine of the Dulles brothers when it came to Korea and Vietnam. Now, what would have happened if the desire for independence by these non-Western nations had been acknowledged? You almost don't even want to go there, and we may never know. But we still have to acknowledge that the powerful elite at that Paris conference set the stage for decades of upheaval in the world, and just a few men at the center of it. Let's talk Israel, because we're talking a timeline. Let's talk Israel. In the book, The Secret War Against the Jews, and all of these books are secular, by the way. They are just historical, and you have to sort through spin and all that, but they're actually really very good books. But this book, Secret War Against the Jews, there's a chapter entitled The Sorcerer of Oil that describes one of the more disturbing abuses of power than I have ever read about, and since it's against God's chosen people, it is all the more grievous, and I think this needs to be mentioned. On page 38 of that book, in the chapter The Sorcerer of Oil, they describe this abuse of power, which I'm only going to be able to touch upon, but you will get the general idea. And I'm quoting from this book, okay. The history books do not even mention the secret partnership of Ibn Saud. No, let me pause. Ibn Saud founded Saudi Arabia. He was the first king of Saudi Arabia. Okay. The secret partnership of Ibn Saud, Jack Philby, a British spy, and Allen Dulles. Together, they were the secret source of oil, wealth, and international influence that worked behind the scenes to put Hitler on the world stage. These men, who fueled the Nazi war machine in the 30s, were the same ones who sabotaged the Jews' last best hope of an escape route to Palestine. The partners in oil, our sources allege, were profoundly evil men who bore substantial responsibility for the Holocaust but escaped the judgment of history. Jack Philby recruited Allen Dulles in the 1920s, first as his agent to influence American policy against the Jewish homeland, and then as his secret partner in the development of Saudi Arabian oil. With Dulles' help, Philby ensured the economic and political survival of Ibn Saud by creating a partnership with American oil companies allied against British interests in favor of Nazi Germany. Philby worked with Nazi intelligence to sabotage international efforts to create a Jewish homeland. When it came to spying on the Zionists, Jack Philby had American partners in crime, and not just any Americans, but the Dulles brothers, two of the most powerful men in the world, and that is in the secret war against the Jews. All right, Philby and Saud betrayed the British Empire by building their own empire, really, the foundations of the modern Middle East, installing oil as the weapon of choice through relationships with the Nazis in the 1920s. Philby dedicated his life to sabotaging Zionist aspirations and restricting immigration and blocking routes to and out of Israel. Now, we are not saying they were the sole architects of the Holocaust, but there's always more to the story than you think there is. They certainly played a huge role in their epic anti-Semitism and bigotry and lust for money and power, and that forms a huge part of this narrative. The secret war against the Jews gives us just enough of that very black story and more info on Allen Dulles than you will ever be able to stomach. Not only was he in multiple right places at the right time to influence the outcome of history, but he was used by the devil to do so. Of course, the Lord had his way in Israel becoming a nation once again. But there are an awful lot of stories behind the scenes. The CIA and Harry Truman, well, the CIA grew out of a wartime agency called the Office of Strategic Services, which was established to help win World War II. It was intended to be a temporary agency with plans to dissolve it at the end of the war. But as tensions grew with the Soviet Union, many within the OSS were determined to keep it intact. So by the end of the war, almost instantly the Cold War was emerging with the next year. And Americans were behind the game already in intelligence gathering, unlike the Russians and the Brits, who'd been engaging in covert operations for years. Well, despite his reservations, Harry Truman signed the National Security Act in 1947, which became the CIA. Now, during World War II, there was a Western International Order. I think the sun is setting on the Western International Order. I think all eyes are on the Eastern Hemisphere right now. And I think that's going to continue until the Lord comes back. But we outsourced the fight against Germany to the Russians. After the war, the U.S. policy against communism was containment. But there's a problem with that because communism isn't dependent upon territorial expansion so much as that it is an ideology. Karl Marx's ideology that can be exported to anyone, anywhere, at any time. But the Dulles is focused on territorial expansion. It could be accomplished through conquest, as shown in Vietnam and Korea, but it's also profoundly ideological. So now the West is living in a constant war footing, and the colonialist mindset of the early part of the last century was as much to blame as anything for getting the U.S. into Vietnam and Korea with the help of the Dulleses. John Dulles was Dwight Eisenhower's Secretary of State from 1953 to 1959. In the tense early years of Cold War politics, Dulles pursued a foreign policy designed to isolate the Soviet Union and undermine the spread of communism. Again, he thought it was the biggest threat to the world. He really was the ultimate Cold Warrior, and both of their service, the brothers' service during Eisenhower's presidency, marks an important watershed in the evolution of American interventionism. Now, with Allen serving as the first director of the CIA, together, the brothers used this agency to eliminate perceived communist threats in the Third World through covert operations, establishing a powerful precedent for regime changes as part of foreign policy strategy. Eisenhower wanted to keep the Third World nations from being swallowed up by communism. Now, this interventionism was framed within the plot of the Cold War. So, an all-encompassing struggle pitting the forces of freedom against revolutionary communism and social imperialism. That was the theme of the era. I'm going to say, in reality, it's about Washington's own global hegemony, which was advanced especially for the sake of elite corporate interests that the Dulles brothers, going back a couple generations actually, had served all throughout their careers. Now, as the nation's top diplomat, John Foster Dulles established hostility towards the communist bloc as an unshakable tenet of U.S. foreign policy. And for him, even worse than the communists were neutralists who immorally refrained. He said it was immoral to refrain from picking sides in the Cold War. He said they were even more of a threat because they threatened to diffuse what he saw as a necessary conflict. And so he framed this anti-colonial independence movement sweeping the Third World after World War II as basically a communist plot. So even if you were neutral, you were part of a communist plot by default. But it was Allen's CIA that gave teeth to his brother's policy. These two were an echo chamber in Washington. There was no one to come against what they believed. Now, Allen completed the transformation of the agency from the intelligence clearinghouse that it started as under Truman to a clandestine paramilitary force that it is today. It didn't start out that way. Eisenhower also saw covert action as a sort of a bloodless way to achieve the U.S.'s political aims, regardless of the blood of foreigners that were spilt in the process. But this is important. Under Allen Dulles, the CIA became a perpetual covert war machine. Even during peacetime, the agency would ceaselessly scheme to subvert and ultimately overthrow any foreign government not in the U.S. orbit. Let's talk about Iran. A lot of us know more of a recent history of Iran, but let's go a little bit farther back, because volumes have been written about U.S.-Iran relations, and in no way can we cover this to a real degree this morning. But just a bit on this, you'll see how it reverberates to this day. A lot of people are unaware that the CIA overthrew Iran's democracy in 4 days back in 1953. Before the Shah, Iran had a prime minister named Mohammad Mossadegh. He was a popular prime minister. He nationalized Iran's oil industry. Well, the CIA decided he had to go. The first try failed because he had learned of the plan. Kermit Roosevelt, grandson of Teddy Roosevelt, was successful in placing him under house arrest for the rest of his life and reinstalling the Shah. Now, this would come back to haunt the world as the Iranian student-led overthrow of the Shah in 1979 was a success, taking U.S. hostages, 52 of them, and holding them for more than a year, 444 days to be exact. I remember it well when that happened. I was just out of high school at the time, and under Jimmy Carter, one of the worst presidents in history. Why did Eisenhower, with Allen Dulles, decide to let the CIA engineer a coup on Iran? Was it about oil, or was it about the fear that Russia would suck Iran into its orbit? Now, Iran and Russia, Persia and Russia, are listed in Ezekiel 38 as part of the Gog and Magog war. So we know in the last days those two will be aligned. Doesn't matter what Allen Dulles thought. But scholars disagree on this subject. It's probably a little bit of both. And controlling the oil resources in developing countries where the U.S. wants to be in control is at the top of my list, along with the Shah being friendly toward the U.S. in reversing the nationalization of Iran's oil. And, you know, the U.S. and Iran have never gotten along anyway. And like I said, they are still in the news almost daily. Now we're looking at a nuclear Iran. So all of these things continue to build in our lifetimes. Well, they barely got a chance to catch their breath from the Iranian overthrow when the Dulleses went after a democratically elected president of Guatemala. And even though John's law firm made a fortune from Guatemala's United Fruit Company, a huge, huge company in those days, the fear of a Soviet-style government, again, being formed under this president set them off again because, well, Guatemala is just too close to the U.S., and now we have a Russian fear, a Cold War fear, there in Guatemala. Well, let's talk about the Bay of Pigs here. The Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961 was a failed attack launched by Allen Dulles and his CIA during the Kennedy administration to push Cuban leader Fidel Castro from power. Since 1959, officials at the U.S. State Department and the CIA had attempted to remove Castro because, you know, he's only 90 miles from Florida. Then on April 17, 1961, the CIA launched what its leaders believed would be the definitive strike, a full-scale invasion of Cuba by 1,400 American-trained Cubans who had fled their homes when Castro took over. However, the invasion was doomed from the start. The invaders were badly outnumbered by Castro's troops. They surrendered in less than 24 hours. And according to the account in the book The Devil's Chessboard by David Talbot, Allen Dulles had rigged it to fail by letting the CIA's least qualified agents run the overthrow, watch it fail, and gamble that JFK would send troops to seal the deal, which he did not. Dulles and JFK's relationship never recovered from that. And Kennedy was not a fan because he felt that nationalism for any nation should be encouraged and allowed to take its course. And he kept Allen Dulles around as CIA agent after Eisenhower and later regretted it. Kennedy did not want to name the airport after a Dulles. Eisenhower had given Allen free rein to police the world for threats against the U.S. position. Kennedy would do no such thing. He did not want to name that airport. But eventually he relented. Did he pay for it with his life? The CIA has long been suspected of killing JFK. Castro, he thought he was going to be blamed. And the theories over the years have been fascinating, to say the least. I had a high school social studies teacher. I'm trying to think of his name at the moment. Anyway, he spent an entire semester combing through the Warren Report, which was the report on what happened with Kennedy's assassination. And he went through that with a fine-tooth comb with us 17-year-olds. And it certainly had my attention. The truth is, it should have been called the Dulles Report because all the holes and the lack of clarity and the lack of truth in there. The other thing we want to note is after Kennedy was taken out, the troops were really ramped up going into Vietnam. In 61, there were only 700 troops in Vietnam. And starting in 64 and 65, 100,000 here, 300,000 there, leading up to 500,000 by the time 69 rolled around, and that was the year that they sent the most troops to Vietnam. So very interesting development there. Let's talk about the Dulles legacy. I call it international financial interests and the doctrine of American exceptionalism, plus an overdeveloped sense of self-interest and self-importance brought on by a life of privilege, entitlement, and the need to control the global narrative, combined with fear and paranoia regarding the ever-present dangers to the U.S. by an ideological enemy. And yes, China and Russia are still a threat. Think about how this started. Nothing has changed there except the players, and we're always in watch mode when it comes to Putin, just like we were with Gorbachev and China and everyone else in this global play. We have Russia and China, threats of cybercrime, weaponizing viruses. I mean, things have really changed on that front. And so, yeah, we are in perilous times, and the threats are exponential. But when you think about the influence of these gentlemen, it has resulted in a world that still operates in many ways by the parameters that they set into place. There's a lot that we don't and cannot know, but pulling back the curtain even a little reinforces that cosmic war that we're all a part of, that we're careening towards a prophesied end, culminating in the coming of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. The God of this world, the kingdoms of this world, they truly do enslave humans. Ideologies enslave humans. Only the gospel can free a person. And God is going to have the last word. I love the song, Kings and Kingdoms Shall All Pass Away, but there's something about that name. Absolutely. And we're just connecting some dots so that you can see the way of this world. And the curtain is pulled back just a little bit to see the powers behind the throne, the kingmakers that have been in this world and in my lifetime, in our lifetimes. The other thing we want to look at, of course, is Israel. Mark Hitchcock has an article, Our World is Witnessing Mounting Threats on Numerous Fronts, the alignment of nations coming together and the threat of war escalating daily, especially in Israel, point towards a prophecy in the Bible, spoken of in Ezekiel in 38 and 39, the Gog and Magog war. And so that is definitely on the plate here. We also want to talk about war, potential for war between Israel and Hezbollah. They're saying it could be any day now. Some are saying it could be a lot longer, but it appears unavoidable at this point unless something major takes place. Some countries are pulling citizens out of Lebanon. Germany, I know, is one. The Netherlands. Germany is considering stopping flights to Lebanon, and that would leave people stranded there. So I think things are getting kind of ugly. It would be a significant game changer, according to Mark Hitchcock, making what's happening in Gaza with Hamas a sideshow in comparison. So that is something you definitely want to watch. Great headlines every single day. And I started with the debate. I think I'm going to end with a topic here real briefly that I think has made Americans the most angry, and that is immigration. U.S. Special Forces warns of imminent terror attack inside America. And I could see the passion with Trump last night when it came to immigration and how I think he really gave Biden a piece of his mind and all that. And Biden is in absolute denial of the blood that is on his hands, even this 12-year-old girl that was killed by immigrants. That, I think, is going to be a game changer. Our country is changing radically. And a huge reason for that is immigration. I never thought I'd see the day when this would be something that they knowingly are foisting on American citizens. And we should be doing the voting, and we have these illegals doing the voting and picking our leaders. It's crazy. So I hope you found all that interesting and that it gives you something to look at or think about when you're reading the headlines, to enable you to understand the headlines a little bit better, because the media is not going to help you with that at all. Remember to visit standupforthetruth.com, sign up for our weekly podcast digest via your email inbox. On the menu, click the subscribe link, enter your first name and email address. Feedback is also encouraged. Comments at standupforthetruth.com. Monday, we're going to have a replay on the history of Stand Up for the Truth. You might find that interesting. Tuesday, T.A. McMahon as we wind up before the holiday weekend. Wisdom and knowledge shall be the stability of your times and the strength of salvation. The fear of the Lord is our treasure. And that's in Isaiah 33:6. Have a great weekend on purpose. God bless.